It's fine. Yeah. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Richard Alderson. I think most of you in the room probably know who I am and what I do. But I'm a tax specialist and I specialise in tax investigations, disputes, and negotiations with HMRC. So, like all of these presentations, I guess just a little bit about me and my career. So, I've had Alderson Tax Limited, my tax consultancy business, for the last 6 years or so. And before that, my employment history is dead straightforward. I only ever had two jobs. The first of those was in for my sins in HMRC. So I dealt with all types of investigations, from criminal prosecution, fraud work, investigations into companies, partnerships, sole traders, and I was an investigation manager for a while. And then moved across to PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I did primarily the same work, but on the other side of the fence, and that was for their clients. So anything from multinationals, large corporates, owner-managed businesses, high net worth individuals, across all taxes. So that's essentially me and my career. I was in HMRC for about 16 years, PwC for about 14 years, and as I say, Alderson Tax for the last 6 years or so. So what we're going to do today is to talk about tax. And you've probably all heard of this very famous quote from Benjamin Franklin back in 1789, talking about nothing is certain in life apart from death and taxes. Well, just to lighten the mood, I'm not going to talk about death today, but I am going to talk about taxes. And for most of us, well, for everybody in this room, we'll all submit tax returns, we'll all pay taxes, we'll all submit self-assessment tax returns, corporation tax returns, VAT returns, whatever you do. But actually, most people don't really have a great deal of interaction, apart from the accountants in the room, with HMRC, or probably understand what sort of organisation they're like. So what I'd like to do today is just try and give you a bit of a flavour about that, about what HMRC are, what kind of organisation they are, and how they conduct their inquiries and how they find out people, and select cases for inquiry and things like that. So tax is interesting, is it? Well, I actually think it's fascinating. I love tax. I've been doing it for all of my life. And it's a big thing in the press as well. So you'll just see from some of the headline sort of images there, the press very much focus around large corporates and about them sheltering tax and should they pay their fair share of tax. Always lots of stuff in the press about celebrities, so people involved in tax avoidance schemes, the kind of Jimmy Carr schemes, take that, things like that. For those of you not local to the northeast in Yorkshire, the person in the top right hand side is Krista Ackroyd, who's a BBC presenter, and she was in the press around her tax arrangements being paid through a limited company and something called IR35, and that went to court. And then in the bottom left is Al Capone, who's not British, but obviously very famously couldn't be prosecuted for his gangster activities, but the government actually prosecuted him for tax offences and put him in prison for tax offences. So tax is always in the public eye. It's very much in the government's eye at the moment as well. They're looking to raise as much tax as possible. Rachel Reeves in her budget and various things, and they're taking lots of steps to try and maximise that tax impact, which has an impact on all of us in this room and all of your clients as well. So HMRC, what actually is it? So HMRC is actually a non-ministerial department, and what that means, it reports to Parliament via the Treasury, and what that means in practice. So, for example, I had a client who was in financial, a really big client who was in financial distress. They went to government, they went to the Department for Business, Industry and Skills, to BIS, and tried to get a rescue plan. And as part of that rescue plan, BIS said, go and speak to HMRC and get a time to pay for the tax that you're payable, because they were going through a refinancing. So they did that. And then when they went to HMRC basically said, we're not interested because we don't take instructions from BIS or any other government department. We report to Parliament via the Treasury. So HMRC have their own kind of code of conduct, and they're regulated not by ministerial departments, but by legislation. So as an organisation, it employs over 66,000 people, collected £828 billion last year, which was an increase of about 5.3% from the previous year. And in the budget in 2024, Rachel Reeves announced investments of an additional 1.4 billion for HMRC to recruit 5,000 new members of staff to try and focus around tax compliance and bringing in more money. And obviously that means more focus around investigations, compliance work with HMRC. So what does it actually do? Well, HMRC does the usual things you'd expect it to do. It administers and collects corporation tax, income tax, capital gains tax, VAT, national insurance, all those kind of things. But it also does lots of other stuff as well. It administers student loans, child tax credits, working families tax credits, and in furlough, it was responsible for running the furlough scheme as well. So what HMRC is in practice is actually it's a multifunctional organisation, and it's not just a tax collection agency, if you like. But one of the big things that HMRC gets criticised for is people say, well, it's not a commercial organisation. It doesn't make commercial decisions. It doesn't help business. And part of the reason for that, obviously, it's down to individuals as well. And some individuals are not very commercially minded within HMRC. But ultimately, HMRC has a statutory obligation for the collection and management of taxes. And what that means in practice is that it's got to deal with people fairly and proportionately and equally, and it's got a duty by law to assess and collect tax within the letter of the law. And often that leads to conversations. I've had loads of conversations with FDs where they go along and say, well, if HMRC don't accept this deal, then the company's going to go into liquidation. And what HMRC say at the other side is, well, we can't accept the deal because it's a deal that you're offering that's not in accordance with our law or practice or procedures. And that often becomes a very difficult situation for businesses because they don't understand and they don't make a proposal that HMRC can actually accept. So what HMRC have got is something called a litigation and settlement strategy, which is their framework to settle disputes, which is what I do all day, every day, if you like. And what that basically says, it's that the disputes have to be resolved in accordance with the law. So you can't do any package deals, you can't do a 50-50 settlement. And HMRC have their hands tied in lots of these negotiations. So that makes it difficult on our side, and sometimes it also makes it difficult on HMRC side as well. But hopefully that's just a very high level overview and a flavour of what HMRC are about. So what does that mean in practice? Well, I'm not going to focus on this slide a great deal, but those are words that have been sort of bandied around to me over my career in tax. And yes, it can be very frustrating. Yes, it can feel very uncommercial. Yes, it can be very expensive. All these in terms of people's mindset is when they're involved in these kind of disputes, it becomes a very uncertain time for them, essentially. So if that brown envelope does drop through your door or does drop through your client's door, then what does it actually mean, and what kind of emotions and reactions do people have? Well, basically, people, the first thing they'll say is, well, I've never been, this is probably once in a lifetime thing. I've never been involved in a tax investigation. So what do I do? How do I deal with it? How does this thing actually work? Because I've actually got no idea, no clue whatsoever. Then the second thing they'll think about is, well, actually, this could be quite serious. What's the impact for me? What's the impact for my business? What's the impact for my family? I've had situations where people's marriages are on the line, people's homes are on the line, people's businesses are on the line, and it can be very serious, in terms of the outcomes and impacts for the client. And they get very worried about that, quite rightly so. And then people start thinking about the practical things about, well, I've never met a tax inspector. Am I going to be interrogated here? What's it going to be like? What's this experience going to be like? And essentially, what they need is some guidance and support to take them through what can be quite a difficult and stressful process. But the same thing for the advisor as well. So for the advisor is, can they manage the risk of a complex and potentially costly investigation? And that's both in terms of giving best advice for the client, and it's also for the practice themselves as well. So, how does it impact on their PI insurance? Are they qualified to do it? Do they have the resources to do that? In terms of taking people out of their kind of normal compliance work to do lots of work around a tax investigation. And do they have the skills to do it? Do they fully understand tax investigations is a lot around tax administration as well as tax technical stuff? And do they have those skills? Because most accountants don't do that on a day-to-day basis. So there's all kind of risks both for the client and for the advisor around these tax investigations or tax disputes. So I guess the question is, what triggers a tax investigation? Well, basically, it's either bad decisions. So people either decide that they're not going to report all of their income or put expenses into their profit and loss account, personal expenses for household expenses, house improvements, whatever the case may be. It can come from pressure of work, where people are focused on their business and they get behind on submission of tax returns, VAT returns, and all of a sudden that starts to become a huge problem for them. Where they've got 3 or 4 years worth of information outstanding, or 3 or 4 sets of VAT returns outstanding, and the longer it gets, the longer these things are not sent in, the more an issue it becomes. Tax is very complicated, and sometimes it arises from complex transactions. Sometimes it arises from lack of knowledge or understanding, or anything like that. So there's all sorts of reasons why tax investigations can arise, and why information is not correctly reported. From a HMRC perspective, what are they looking for? Well, they're looking for errors and omissions in tax returns. They're looking at people who haven't told HMRC that they're actually chargeable to tax or VAT in the first place. They'll look at the actual accounts and information submitted. So they'll look at whether there are low profits, low gross profit rates, lower than expected drawings. They'll look at fluctuations in results. They'll also get information from informants and voluntary disclosures as well. And you'd be amazed how much information HMRC do get through those sources, actually. And probably most importantly is the bottom one there, is information held by HMRC. So I guess the question is, what information do HMRC hold? Well, what they do is they have a database called Connect. And what HMRC do is they profile information and they risk assess pretty much every return that goes into HMRC. So millions of tax returns, millions of VAT returns, and they'll look at that, and then from that they'll decide whether they should conduct further inquiries. So this HMRC Connect database, it's been developed over the last 7 or 8 years. A huge cost for a government department. I think the costs are around about £80 million. But what that database holds is over, I think the latest figures I've seen is over 55 billion items of information. So it includes bank records. So it will include all of my bank records. For example, the banks will report details of all the bank accounts that I hold, all credit cards that I've got. They'll have details of my credit referencing information through things like Equifax or those credit referencing agencies. They'll have property details from land registry and other property information. They get information from online platforms, so eBay, Vinted, all those sort of things. So if you're carrying on a side hustle business, I think HMRC, or the press called it the Snoopers Charter, didn't they? I think, but HMRC get access to all those transactional information on online platforms, vehicle records, social media accounts, local authority registers. They've got access to huge amounts of information, and they've got a statutory right to get all that information. And as I say, what they do is they profile and risk assess that information to decide whether they should inquire further to check whether tax returns are correct and complete, or whether there should be any monetary settlement. So don't underestimate the amount of information that HMRC have got. It does feel like Big Brother, and to an extent, it probably is. They hold more information now than they've ever held in the past. So if that brown envelope does drop through your door, what does an inquiry actually look like? Well, there are basically 5 stages of an investigation. The first stage is the opening stage, and that usually is an opening letter, is a brown envelope. And when that comes through, what I look at is, I look at, where does it come from? Which office does it come from? Because HMRC have got lots of different offices doing lots of different sort of types of work. If it comes from, for example, the Fraud Investigation Service, that means it's very, very serious. The HMRC believe that there's tax fraud, potential criminal prosecutions, and things like that. If it's a local office, then or a specialist office, different inquiries from different people mean different things. You'd also look at who the inquiry is actually from. Is it from an inspector of taxes? Is it from an officer, a lower grade officer? What's the detail of the inquiry? And what you're trying to understand is, what does the inquiry actually relate to? So, for example, I had a call from an accountant a couple of days ago. They got a client who he had a job, about 150 grand a year, well-paid job, but he also had a kind of side business where he restored and sold classic cars. And what they did, the accountant had submitted accounts for the classic car business, and those accounts had shown a loss in 2 years. And the accountants had quite rightly set the loss against other income to reduce the tax liability. So HMRC issued an inquiry letter. And basically, they asked for every piece of paper that the business had. They asked for all the sales records, all the purchase records, bank statements, everything that the business had. And I got a phone call from the accountant saying, well, how do we respond to this? And the answer is, well, actually, what does the inquiry relate to in the first place? Because HMRC don't have to tell you, but in this particular case, it could be that, is the sale of cars, should it be a capital gain or should it be income tax? Is the business trading commercially and with a view to profit, i.e., are they entitled to set their losses against other profits? Or are they looking at expenses of the business and saying the expenses are overstated? But until you understand that, when HMRC are asking for every piece of paper, you can't work out or you can't conclude whether the information request is reasonable, proportionate, and HMRC have to request information which is for the purposes of checking a taxpayer's tax position based on those risks that they've identified. So you have the opening letter, you have the information gathering stage, and then you try and establish the facts relating to the dispute. And it's amazing how many times that I get involved where the underlying facts aren't agreed or known by either side, by HMRC or by or by the accountant or the taxpayer. So it's important to agree what those facts are. And then the fourth stage of technical discussions. So what's the technical basis? What's the legal basis for settlement along the lines of this litigation and settlement strategy that I mentioned? And finally, we look towards settlement. So how do you reach a settlement? What are HMRC's governance procedures? How can you settle it within the law? How can you get the best result for the client and reduce the cash cost? How can you reduce and mitigate penalties? So essentially, those are the 5 steps that I take when I get involved in a tax dispute with HMRC. But tax is complicated, and tax investigations and tax disputes is about managing risk, and it's also about managing people as well. And it's about ensuring that HMRC act within the law and act within their procedures. It's about trying to take away the stress from the client and to an extent their advisors as well. It's trying to help people understand what that process looks like and the impact for them, their businesses, and their families as well. And as I say, it's to reduce penalties, it's to reduce cash costs. And ultimately, if things have gone wrong, it's to get them back into the compliance, get them back on the straight and narrow, and really getting them to do what they do best, which is running their business and focusing on their business and making profits and really having an easy life. So it's about taking that stress away. So, in a nutshell, and in a very quick run through, I can talk about this for days, but that's essentially what I do and how I approach HMRC tax disputes and investigations. The aim for me is always to work with clients and to work with their advisors, and it's not to take over the inquiry. It's not to take over the client. I'm not an accountant. I don't do tax compliance. I do tax disputes. And the aim is to help them, assist them, and give them back to their existing advisors, and as I say, help them do what they do best and carry on and run their businesses. So that's me, and that's my presentation. As I say, I hope you found that informative, not necessarily entertaining, but if you have any questions, then please let me know. Thank you.
Richard, that example about the classic car restorer, yeah?
Yep.
Could that not have been regarded as a hobby?
Exactly. So HMRC might be looking at whether it's not commercial and it's a hobby business, right?
Yeah.
And they just, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, many years ago, I've always been a musician. Many years ago, I did a little bit of part-time teaching, and I played in an orchestra, and occasionally I played in amateur operatic shows for money, but I made a loss. And I claimed a loss for several years. And after a while, I thought, no, this isn't right. I can't really push this, certainly not in my profession with my reputation. So I simply stopped claiming the loss and everything went quiet. But I'd been claiming capital allowances on my instruments and that sort of thing,
Yeah.
But the fact is that if you are making money and it's genuinely a hobby, you're not taxed on it. But you have to be careful.
Indeed, and it's the same with things like, as I say, HMRC have got access to online platforms. So, if you're selling, whatever it is, you're selling clothes on eBay or whatever the case may be. It may be you're just selling excess stuff from your wardrobe.
Yeah,
But if that then turns into there are 500 transactions a year, and yeah,
yes,
and it becomes more of a business operation rather than just selling personal chattels or personal assets or personal clothes, then HMRC will take a different view. And that's why in these situations, Chris, it's so important to establish the facts,
yes,
and often HMRC will jump to conclusions, and often, the client will jump to conclusions, and they're just miles apart in terms of what their understanding of the actual underlying facts are around these sorts of things.
yeah.
think I have a
Richard, I've
question.
got a question.
Hmm.
Sorry, Lisa.
All right.
First of all, thank you for that. I thought that was a brilliant presentation, and your passion for what you do and how you do it absolutely shone through. But it's
Yeah,
fascinating.
I agree. Yeah.
My question is, and it relates to my brother-in-law who ran a fish and chip shop and had at one point a dispute with HMRC, which got settled. But he was always convinced afterwards that there was almost like a black mark against him, and they've got a list of previous offenders that they're more likely to look at in the future. Do you think that's correct?
I don't, Nigel, no, to be honest with you. What HMRC have is, if you look on their website, they've got a list, they publish a list of deliberate defaults, as they call it. So these are people that are involved in cases where there's been fraud, or people that have been peddling tax avoidance schemes and things like that that have been involved in some fairly questionable transactions. And in those cases where there are certain conditions met, then HMRC will actually publish the details of those people, and that can have a massive reputational effect. If you've gone through an investigation and you've been brought back into compliance, which is clearly what's happened in your case, then that shouldn't impact on HMRC's thinking. But what they will do is they will risk assess the returns. And as part of that risk assessment, they will look at the history. But I don't think it means that because you've been investigated in year one and you've been settled, that they'll automatically investigate you into year two unless they think there's a problem. The idea is to resolve whatever the dispute is, and then you're back on the straight and narrow, and you carry on doing what you're going to do.
Okay. Cheers.
Richard, couple of three things really. I used to really look forward to my postman walking up the drive. Now, I've just got this terrible sort of gut thing, and I'm not looking forward to the rattling of the letterbox. Secondly, great picture there. Is that a young Piers Morgan? And thirdly, we know there's a lot of corruption from COVID and what have you. It seems as you're very closely in HMRC. Where are they in terms of all the big fraud that happened from 2020, 21, 22 onwards? And I know things take forever. Are they catching up? Are they on the big stuff, or what? I'm just sort of curious.
To be honest with you, Max, on furlough related stuff, I thought that would be um, a huge issue for HMRC. And personally, I haven't seen a great deal of activity around furlough and COVID related fraud. Where it tends to get investigated tends to be with insolvency practitioners, where businesses go under and they've got things like bounce backs and things like that. So it tends to be at the insolvency level rather than the HMRC level. I have seen inquiries into furlough claims, but I have to say it's not as much as I thought that there would be, sort of following, because the numbers that were bandied around at the time were eye-wateringly high in terms of the level of fraud. But my personal view is I don't think HMRC have really got the resources or been given the resources to actually investigate a lot of this stuff, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, my conversations with the cats, I'm sure.
Can I ask very quickly, because my battery's going to go, and then I have to disappear and get charger. Sorry, I wasn't expecting to be here. I get a letter every year, Richard. I really enjoyed that presentation, and to be honest, I wasn't expecting to. So well done. I get a letter every year from my accountant saying, "Insure yourself against this to an HMRC tax inspection." Would that insurance give me someone like you?
Yes, it would. I mean, to be fair, there are a number of accountants in the room, and for some low-level inquiries, then accountants are perfectly capable of dealing with a lot, if not the vast majority of inquiries that HMRC raise, because some of the inquiries are things like, you've claimed this in your accounts. Can you just confirm what this is, please? So it's fairly low level stuff.
This is
I tend
against
to get involved.
investigation.
Yeah, I tend to get involved where it's a little bit more complicated and the numbers are a bit higher, and the risks are much higher, as I say, both for the professional and for the client. So in answer to your question, yes, that investigation insurance will cover you for a lot of what you do. Your accountants will support you and will deal with probably the vast majority of queries and questions that HMRC might ask.
Another point as well. My friend's grandson has recently been done by the taxman, HMRC, for his vintage sales, and he's not sold that much. But when he's changing his like trainers and tracksuits all the time, the value is really quite high now of some of these things that he wears twice and sells on. And they've come after him. I think it was anything over £1,000. So
yeah,
yeah.
if you're actually trading, Lisa, it's back to what Chris said, isn't it? It really depends on the facts and circumstances and whether he's just selling personal goods or whether he's actually, the work that's been done is actually tantamount to a trade, effectively.
I think that tax investigation insurance is worthwhile. It's only a couple of £100 a year or something like that. I mean, I think I'm absolutely clean. I don't know how anybody could challenge me because I can't afford to be an offender, but I still pay that premium because if you are challenged, you're going to need somebody like you, Richard, or my own accountant up to a point, because I do have an accountant. I don't do accountancy anymore, really. They need to be paid. And I think it's a worthwhile thing, £200 a year, to know that you can give the right answers to the tax man because you've got professional help in that regard.
Yeah, I think the point I'm making, Chris, is that it can be quite scary. It's about making sure you give the right answers. Sometimes HMRC exceed their statutory powers and ask for things they're not entitled to, and they take, they go on things like fishing expeditions which is the same with my classic cow, where they're asking for every piece of paper, and then trying to find something. So they're working the wrong way around rather than what they should be doing, which is actually identifying risks and then testing those risks by reference to the documentation and the facts and all that kind of stuff. So it's about making sure you've got the right support, whether that's from your local accountant or from somebody more specialist like me, just to help you through a difficult situation, really.